Perfect. Perfect.
Oh!
This is Kirby, one of Nintendo's most revered and simply adorable mascots. Conceived by one of the most heralded video game developers in the industry, Masahiro Sakurai, Kirby is the titular central figure of his home series, with entries that are noteworthy for their exceedingly simple yet immensely fun gameplay. But don't be fooled by his deceptively wholesome and delightfully jolly appearance, because canonically, Kirby is an absolute powerhouse. Capable of annihilating droves of omnipotent threats with such graceful ease that even Kratos has probably given the little guy the silent nod of approval followed by a paternal grunt. However, Kirby's immense power wasn't confined to just his own series, as when Masahiro Sakurai created the genre-defining Super Smash Bros. All the way back in 1999, Kirby was, coincidentally, an absolute menace on the battlefield.
Been such a good edge guarder. Oh, that kills.
That's gonna kill.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a certain percent for that for us.
He had it all. He was able to maneuver back on stage by utilizing his multiple jumps, a staple of his home series, whereas most characters were bestowed with such minuscule and pathetic recovery options that looked like they were being over-encumbered by 20-pound dumbbells in their trousers. Trust me, I know the sensation, especially after I read a naughty magazine or just really have to take a piss. He had some exceptional moves, such as his monster of an up tilt that almost single-handedly catapulted him to the top of the tier list with its disjointed hitbox and incredible combo potential. And on top of that, he also had a very strong forward air. However, one of his most rage-inducing moves, for the opponent at least, is his nigh impossible to avoid down air that not only decimates the enemy's shield, but also comes packed with individual hits that all serve as spikes. Just in case you thought this little guy didn't already have a stranglehold on the game's tier lists. Kirby was incredible. And then along came Super Smash Bros. Melee. Melee is renowned for its extremely fast-paced, high-octane combat, which is perfectly suited towards the game's passionate competitive scene. Some characters survived the transition quite well. Others might have struggled a little bit, but at least held their own on the game's numerous tier lists. And then there was Kirby.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
Out of all the characters that made the transition from Smash 64 to Melee, Kirby undoubtedly took the brunt of the transitional damage. Remember all of those aforementioned moves that single-handedly made Kirby a dominant force in 64's roster? They were all gutted, tossed to the wayside, or made so unbearably weak that you almost start to feel bad for the little guy. Oh, and let's not forget Kirby's grab, which is so laughably atrocious due to the fact that it's one of the only grabs in the game that you can escape with ease while in the middle of the throwing animation. Yeah, Kirby was gutted, mutilated, tossed in the ocean to be used as metaphorical shark bait, and his placement towards the bottom of Melee's tier list has only been perpetuated if the subsequent Smash Bros. Entries are anything to go by. Turns out this was all intentional, as Masahiro Sakurai had allegedly received letters from disgruntled fans that complained about Kirby's immense combat prowess in the first Smash Bros. Game, and accused him of playing favorites since it was a character that he helped bring to fruition. And while I can commend Sakurai for his efforts to make Kirby his pink, rotund, needlessly jolly ball of joy a less overbearing force in the Smash series' meta, it would at least be somewhat nice to see him hang towards the middle section of the tier list. Miracles can happen, right? This is what I'm talking about today. Overpowered characters from video games that were nerfed into oblivion. Enjoy! Okay, so the Fallout series and balance are two things that are radically antithetical to one another for a hefty array of reasons. You have the smorgasbord of absurdly powerful weapons that range from laser rifles to a gas-powered blade that erupts in flames and requires a goddamn oven mitt to operate, to a device capable of hurling a fucking mini-nuke, just in case a machine gun wasn't enough to satiate your gluttonous desire for the color red. Then you have the perks. My god, the perks. But in this video, I'm covering a specific element of the Fallout series that isn't conventionally associated with the word overpowered. At least not from what I've read up on. I'm talking about the companions.
Hey, boy, you know any tricks?
Companions are a staple of the Fallout series, and for good reason, mind you. Hell, companions mesh with the Fallout series like peanut butter and jelly. Unless you're attempting a stealth play style. In that case, they go together more like Oreos and black tar heroin. After your expedition in the post-apocalyptic wasteland begins, you'll more than likely stumble across an area that houses a particular character in need of your assistance, either during the events of the main story or in a completely isolated side quest. But that begs the question, why do I need a companion? Well, a few reasons really. Sometimes the desolate wasteland gets a little lonesome, and you might need a four-legged friend or a bipedal bro to keep you company. Plus, they come equipped with their own weapons, personalities, fighting styles, stats, and if you're ever feeling bogged down by all of those Nuka-Cola bottles in your inventory that you're never going to use, because you want to display them all on a shelf for some reason, then you can rest easy, knowing that your companions also serve as makeshift storage containers. Except for Jericho. I trust him with my valuable goodies as much as I'd trust Preston Garvey to help any settlements on his own accord without giving me a bulk of the workload. Fuck you, Jericho. Why don't you go fire at that nuke and megaton from 3 feet away? I promise it's not active, it's just good target practice.
Asshole.
However, for the most part, Fallout companions don't provide an exorbitant amount of assistance in most scenarios, unless you just need a little extra firepower, because they're mostly there for the experience, for getting to know the character and understanding their lore, that sort of deal. But there is one exception: companion perks. After traveling with your companion for a while, they'll often bestow you with a perk that usually provides some sort of statistical advantage, either in combat, speech scenarios, hacking, etc. But in this video, we have to specifically look at Fallout 4. See, Fallout 4 introduced the affinity system, a mechanic that allows companions to react either positively or negatively to your actions, depending on what morals and beliefs they operate under. And if you max out your companion's affinity, you'll obtain their companion perk, and let me tell you, even as someone who loves Fallout 4, I can admit that it's an extremely long-winded and arduous process. For example, Preston, being the goody two-shoes uniting force of the Commonwealth, loves when you perform virtuous deeds and strongly dislikes when you perform heinous acts, like murder against the innocent, or just being a general dickhead. Then there's Strong, the towering super mutant with a penchant for Shakespeare, who harbors disdain for just about everything you do for some reason. Unless you cannibalize a corpse, of course, because Strong eats that shit up like candy. I'm gonna guess he's either a death metal fan or a Silence of the Lambs type of guy, you choose. Needless to say, getting every obtainable companion to max out their affinity is a journey in and of itself, and for some characters, it just really wasn't worth the hassle. But in the early days of Fallout 4, there was one crystal clear exception: MacCready.
Your thoughts?
The open road and a loaded weapon. Doesn't get much better than this.
In the town of Goodneighbor lies a bar named the Third Rail, and once inside, you'll find none other than Robert MacCready, yes, the same one who we saw as a child back in Fallout 3,
Don't take another step or we'll blow your fucking head off.
exchanging a few words with two troublemaking fiends. After this series of exchanges concludes, you can hire MacCready for 250 caps to aid you in the Commonwealth. After you do this, grind out MacCready's affinity, complete the side quest that he provides you with, because he's one of few companions in this game that only gives you his perk after completing a side quest, and congratulations, you've been awarded with Kill Shot, a destructive companion perk that gives you an extra 20% accuracy when aiming for headshots by using the VAT system. Already, this sounds like a monumental perk to add to your hefty list of abilities, but when the game first released, a coding error rendered this companion perk even more potent than it already was. So much so that MacCready had instantaneously skyrocketed to the top of the game's companion tier lists. Instead of providing a 20% increase to your accuracy, you were blessed with a mind-boggling 2,000% increase, meaning that if you were to target an enemy through VATS and aim for the head, you'd more than likely have a roughly 95% chance of scoring the kill. Now, of course, there was always a catch to this thing. MacCready certainly isn't a character that you can easily max out your affinity with, as he enjoys it when you partake in stealing, but not pickpocketing, because of fucking course not, when you're a belligerent slimeball to even the most amicable of NPCs, or simply just about anything else that makes you appear as abrasive or mean-spirited as you can imagine. Here, let's tell this grieving parent that their long-lost child was a pussy for getting capped.
If your daughter was that stupid, she got what she deserved.
Well, that was charming. What's gotten into you?
MacCready, what the fuck? But it didn't matter, because the companion perk was so omnipotent that everybody was getting in line to be in MacCready's good graces, regardless of their playstyle. However, shortly after this, Bethesda issued a patch that rectified the coding error, meaning that MacCready was now relegated to only provide the 20% accuracy increase. Now, granted, MacCready isn't a terrible companion in Fallout 4, far from it, as the perk itself is actually fairly practical, but his days of glory were certainly long behind him, as the comparatively meager 20% increase, while solid, is a far cry from what it used to be. Alright, so let's talk about a fighting game with as much balance as a lopsided seesaw. We're talking about Injustice: Gods Among Us.
It took me about 5...
After 2011's Mortal Kombat 9 had almost single-handedly rekindled public interest in Mortal Kombat as a series, NetherRealm Studios tried their hand at something a little different, a modern fighting game that revolved around DC superheroes. The idea had already been firmly established by Justice League Task Force, and the core concept of DC superheroes duking it out would be perpetuated, to an extent at least, with Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe. But much like Bruno, there's a reason we don't talk about it, and no, I'm not referring to animated Bruno, I'm talking about homoerotic construction worker Bruno.
Yeah, well, get out of it. Your finger's in my alley.
Not yet.
Regardless, Injustice Gods Among Us had successfully proven that NetherRealm Studios wasn't a one-trick pony when it came to game development, because by the time it released, Injustice Gods Among Us was a smash hit, and considered by many fans as the first proper DC superheroes fighting game. Now, naturally, Injustice Gods Among Us would go on to receive DLC characters, ranging from the sorceress Zatanna, who made me realize that fishnets coupled with magician's attire is a match made in heaven. Step up your fucking game, David. To the likes of General Zod, and one of my personal favorites, Martian Manhunter. Just don't light your cigarette in front of him, and I'm sure he won't violently piss himself into stress, but he probably can't do that anyway if his true form is anything to go by. But there was one DLC character that caused a very destructive, albeit transient ripple in the game's community. None other than the poster boy for the Mortal Kombat series, Scorpion.
Your soul will burn.
Now, the developers didn't overcomplicate things. They made Scorpion the ninja in the streets and freak in the sheets that you all know and love. He's got the chains, the commanding voice, the compulsion to break out the classic party move, where he throws an invisible rope and pulls you over, except it's an actual rope with a spear on the end, and it culminates with a hospital bill worth your life savings. And naturally, the ability to casually forge fire from his palms like the trigger-happy pyromancer that he always wanted to be. But therein lies the problem. Scorpion was effectively a Mortal Kombat character to the fullest extent in an Injustice game, without any of the compromises that Sub-Zero and Raiden received in Injustice 2. Let me explain. See, the Injustice series, despite having some game mechanic crossover, is a far more beginner-friendly fighting game franchise than Mortal Kombat, at least in my opinion, with attacks generally causing more airtime to your opponent, which in turn generally yields more combo potential. That's just one of many examples, as I haven't even touched on character abilities, stage transitions, and interactables, so on and so forth. You get the idea. However, this in turn leads to some necessary substitutions for each of the characters. For example, in Injustice 2, Sub-Zero is unable to freeze his opponent off of a simple ice projectile, like in the Mortal Kombat series, as he has to amplify the projectile with the meter burn mechanic in order to cause a freezing effect. None of these compromises, however, had applied to Scorpion, with very few exceptions, as he was effectively Mortal Kombat 9 Scorpion, but with 10 times the lethality, a playstyle oriented around mix-ups, and a plethora of quality of life changes. If Akuma from Tekken 7 was a nightmare, Scorpion was a fucking demon. Let's talk about the teleport ability. See, one of the distinguishing factors about Injustice is how it manages blocking. In Mortal Kombat, you hold down a dedicated button in order to initiate a block. But in Injustice, and most other fighting games for that matter, you're confined exclusively to holding the back button while your opponent is attacking you. Not a big deal, right? Well, Scorpion's day one teleport was lightning fast, only providing his opponents with an extremely slim window of opportunity to block or counter the teleport, but by then, it was too little too late. Scorpion was already behind you, ready to lay down the smackdown or give you a humiliating Kakashi-patented 1,000 years of death, just in case you didn't already think he was a massive pain in the shithole to begin with. However, Scorpion's immense combat prowess came to light at this tournament in 2013, where out of the 8 finalists, 4 of them were Scorpion players, and his overabundance of appearances at said tournament led to a multitude of audible boos from the audience. Needless to say, NetherRealm had to react fast, or risk widespread backlash from the game's community, and oh boy, react they did. In a subsequent patch, Scorpion was absolutely fucking decimated with the nerfs that he was cursed with. They weakened quite literally every single one of his practical moves, even if they only provided a marginal boost to the character initially. It was so drastic that Scorpion almost single-handedly devolved into one of NetherRealm's most notoriously nerfed characters, beginning life as arguably a top 5 character before being sent plummeting to his demise as a bottom 3 fighter. Needless to say, NetherRealm would continue to release a handful of post-release DLC fighters, which ranged from moderately useful to absolutely earth-shattering in their potency. And guess what? These guys were never nerfed, or at least they weren't nearly as weakened as poor Scorpion was. By the time Injustice 2 came around, the developers had seemingly already learned their lesson, as Sub-Zero would remain a mid to occasionally high-tier character, and Raiden would retain a mid to low-tier placement. Alright, so let's talk about a game that I bet you were not expecting to have overpowered characters in any capacity, Mario Tennis Aces. After the underwhelming launch of the Mario Tennis game for the Wii U, which name escapes me at the moment, I don't know why I didn't write this down, Mario Tennis Aces was a much more commendable and thoroughly well-respected entry in one of Mario's most ubiquitous sports title spin-offs. It wasn't perfect by any metric, but my god, compare it to this thing, and it's like placing a Celine Dion concert next to a fucking Yoko Ono patented screeching session. However, while the game was a commercial hit and a critical improvement over its predecessor, there was one minute, sticky-fingered, possibly snot-infested little bastard that made people realize that a fucking Mario Tennis game could have overpowered characters in its roster: Bowser Jr. Oh, don't shit a brick, bud. You still have no fucking clue who your bitch-bearing mother is. And I reckon you have a half-sibling out there whose dad isn't the main antagonist of a video game series. Get fucked. Now, Bowser Jr. wasn't the only top-tier pick in Mario Tennis Aces, as Waluigi, for example, was also extremely overpowered in his heyday. But it was almost exclusively Bowser Jr. that was garnering the forefront of attention when it came to his tennis-playing prowess. But in order to fully comprehend just why Bowser Jr. was such a powerhouse on the tennis court, we have to briefly explain the character classes. All around, defensive, powerful, speedy, technical, and tricky. All around is pretty self-explanatory. They have well-rounded stats and can be likened to the classic phrase, jack of all trades but master of none. You have powerful, the also self-explanatory class, that can give a tennis ball a bigger wallop than a steroid-obsessed bodybuilder, just minus the shrunken genitals and the sporadic bouts of roid rage. Then there's speedy, the class composed of characters who can retrieve the tennis ball with little to no issues on account of their immense momentum. And of course, tricky, the class specializing in successfully initiating unpredictable trick shots that are made to provide an edge on the court. However, in the early days of Mario Tennis Aces, it was the defensive class that almost single-handedly dominated the game's meta, and it exclusively applied to two characters, well, at least prior to the game's numerous updates, Waluigi and Bowser Jr. The defensive class itself operates on a fairly straightforward principle. You're given top-tier means of returning the ball by being able to successfully cover almost the entirety of the court at the expense of speed and raw power when connecting the hit. Sounds like a fair compromise at a cursory assessment at least. That is, until you take this from the conceptual phase to the practical phase. Bowser Jr. did not lack the speed that he was originally supposed to be hindered by, as he was more than able to recover the ball regardless of what position he was in. You could see the ball soaring towards the fucking neighbor's yard, and Bowser Jr. would probably violently crash through the picket fences and assorted flower beds if it meant returning the ball. However, there's also one more aspect of the defense class that hasn't been mentioned. This class also specializes at rapidly increasing the special meter, meaning that Bowser Jr. wasn't just a savant at promptly returning the ball, but he could just as easily deliver a special move that could send the ball hurtling towards you like a meteorite with a functioning V8 engine installed for maximum speed and contact damage. It was a fucking nightmare, and Bowser Jr. was now even more of a grim reminder of the horrors of unprotected sex. Though, let's be honest, if you played this game competitively, you probably didn't have to worry about maintaining your abstinence to begin with. So Bowser Jr. and Waluigi would both immediately overtake this game and claim the top tier spot of the game's respective tier lists, both due to the defensive class being an intrinsically overpowered class and the particular stats that both were coded with. Needless to say, the audience was enraged at Bowser Jr.'s immense power, and eventually Nintendo responded by both balancing Waluigi to make him a far more manageable opponent and absolutely decimating Bowser Jr.'s stats to the point where he is, hilariously, now considered one of the worst characters in the game from a competitive standpoint. They severely reduced his movement speed, lowered the range of his trick shots, and drastically increased his energy costs for late trick shots that he originally abused relentlessly. And if you think that's rough though, guess what? They decided to nerf him even further in a subsequent patch, which decreased the range of his lateral technical shots and reduced the height in which he was able to hit the ball. Yeah, Bowser Jr. wasn't just weakened, he was dragged by his feet, slit down the middle, and punctured on a hook like cattle for the slaughter. He had his 15 minutes of fame, but much like any overzealous one-hit wonder without a backup plan, his attempts at regaining the limelight hit him like a sack of bricks, as he was sent careening to the bottom of the game's competitive tier lists.
Okay, guys, watch me go to work.
Alright, so let's talk about a fighting game series that I, shockingly enough, do not talk about much on this channel, the Street Fighter series. So listen, I love me some Street Fighter, but I'm admittedly more of a Smash Brothers, Mortal Kombat, Marvel vs. Capcom type of guy. But hey, Street Fighter has earned my respect as a series. Hell, Ultra Street Fighter 4 alone is one of my favorite fighting games of all time, and Street Fighter 6 is most definitely climbing up the ranks as well the more I play it. That being said, we have to talk about a title in the series that initially garnered a bit of a polarizing reception, in the Street Fighter community at least, before gradually becoming one of the franchise's most lauded entries, Street Fighter 3. Street Fighter 3 was an audacious gamble for the series, as it opted to toss most of the tried and true characters that had already been established in the second entry off to the wayside in favor of a fresh, hip new roster, as well as new mechanics, and a major graphical overhaul, boasting some of the most fluid and impressive fighting game animations for the time. But the characters are what we're going to be honing in on today. You have Oro, a combat-efficient recluse who looks like Homer Simpson if he were one meth pipe away from setting the local governor's house on fire. Then there's Dudley, one of my personal favorite Street Fighter characters. He's a prim and proper British boxer who lectures his opponent on manners and etiquette while swiftly shattering their bones with his lightning-fast punches. He's like Mike Tyson in his prime, but with a more calm demeanor and enough of a heart to leave you walking away with both your ears intact. You'll still be eating out of a tube for the rest of your life though, so don't get too overwhelmed with excitement. And then there's Q, the enigmatic, trenchcoat-clad, robot-esque figure that has allegedly been spotted at murder scenes, but if you ask me, the worst this guy's done is either breathe heavily on the other end of a phone call or assist a vengeful father in the quest to find his long-lost son. But the character that we're talking about is arguably one of Street Fighter's most underrated characters, Sean. Sean is one of a handful of Street Fighter characters that never escaped their debut game as a playable fighter. In terms of playstyle, he shares an abundance of similarities to the likes of Ken and Ryu, and in terms of personality, Sean adopts a very underdog-centric type of attitude. And it's unfortunate because when Street Fighter 3's Second Impact, a massive update for the game that released in late 1997, had dropped, Sean inadvertently became one of the most undisputed top tiers of the game. See, what he excelled at in Second Impact was taking advantage of the most minuscule of openings and ruthlessly abusing them with little to no risk. And all I can say is thank God I'm not talking about Hakan, because let's be honest, this oily bastard probably does so without consent. He's packed with an arsenal of moves that are lightning fast and often put Sean in an advantageous state against his opponent. But what if I told you that that wasn't even the best part? See, Sean has a multitude of moves that can easily be chained into his EX moves or super moves. And in some instances, if you put all of them together, Sean is capable of dishing out destructive combos that chain all three types of moves in one string. But of course, this wouldn't be nearly as impressive if Sean wasn't able to inflict heavy damage, but don't worry, you can bet your sweet ass that Sean had no trouble melting health bars like the absolute fucking menace that he was. Almost single-handedly, Sean's absurdly overpowered moveset propelled him towards the top of the charts, and the ostensibly forgettable fighter was now finding his footing in the game's competitive scene. However, there's one problem. Sean was supposed to be a joke character. He was to be Street Fighter 3's closest parallel to Dan Hibiki, the pink-clad, comic relief character of the series that has since cemented himself as a fan favorite due to his brash, conceited personality and intentionally weak special moves that are made to poorly mimic Ryu and Ken's fighting styles. Yeah, this was what Sean was supposed to be, but the developers unintentionally forged a competitive nightmare. So for lore reasons, and for the fact that a fucking joke character was on the same pedestal as the likes of Akuma from a competitive standpoint, he was nerfed a lot. By the time Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, the final major updated version of the game, had been released, poor Sean was absolutely slaughtered. It was a massacre, not of the Texas Chainsaw variety, mind you, but more like the 99 patch Sean was massacred in, title still pending. Sean devolved from living the high life towards the top of the tier list to slumming it out with the bottom tiers. You see, Sean suffers from being a dollar store rendition of other characters, because his moves are intentionally designed in that fashion. For example, Ryu's Crouching Fierce attack has a 5-frame startup, but is also -8 on block. Ken's is a 7-frame startup, but has a quicker recovery time being -6 on block. Sean, however, was cursed with a significantly worse version of the two aforementioned moves, as his comes with a 7-frame startup but a -9 on block. Jesus Christ. On top of that, do you remember how I mentioned that he comes packed with standard moves that chain into EX moves and super moves? Well, toss that out the goddamn window, because Sean was stripped of both of these combos and given practically nothing in return. And just to add insult to injury, Sean's punish potential was made practically non-existent, as his punishes are either too slow, too limited, or sometimes a mixture of both. Sean was an absolute disgrace compared to his glory days, and it didn't doesn't help that the developers stated in an interview that Sean's vast array of nerfs were 100% intentional, as they had no plans of altering him after the release of Third Strike. To this day, Sean remains a very polarizing character. On one hand, those that experience the character's peak competitive viability yearn for a day when he's a playable character again, while others remain convinced that there's no point in having Sean exist in a video game universe where Dan remains the premier joke character. However, with Street Fighter VI continuing to add more characters and content for nearly 3 years now, who knows? We may see Sean make a triumphant comeback. Okay, so this one is a bit of an unorthodox entry, but I think it's at least relatively appropriate for the list. We're talking about one of Mario's adversaries, the garlic-munching, ass-shaking, bike-riding, and violently flatulent Wario. Wario is a man of many talents. When he's not the star of his own series of rapid-fire minigames, hitting the tennis court, or partaking in extreme go-karting, Wario sporadically finds himself smack dab in the center of his own platforming adventures. While video games centered around Wario aren't nearly as prevalent as they used to be, that hasn't stopped Wario from occasionally stealing the spotlight from Mario in the gang. Arguably, Wario's most consistent string of games would stem from his Wario Land series, beginning life on the Game Boy before eventually landing an entry on the Wii with Wario Land Shake It. It was a charming series of platformers that helped firmly cement Wario's personality and his abilities, but here's something I bet you probably didn't know about the zigzag mustachioed anti-hero. Wario, at one point, was canonically immortal. No, that's not a clickbait statement or a hyperbolic stretch of the truth. Wario was in fact fucking immortal in 2 of the Wario Land games, giving him a significant leg up over his chipper adversary, Mario. See, in Wario Land 2 and 3, with very few exceptions, it is impossible for enemies to fully eliminate Wario. In fact, in both of these games, the player can actually utilize Wario's immortality for their own personal benefit. See, if you're attacked by a standard enemy in either one of these games, Wario will become temporarily stunned and drop a handful of coins. However, if you're attacked by specific enemies, Wario will actually react to these attacks in an eclectic amount of ways, and can often use these traditionally perilous scenarios to his benefit, as they can help the player solve puzzles, access secret areas, and so on and so forth. If you're attacked by a fire enemy, for example, Wario will dash around in a flame-induced frenzy, temporarily become one with the fireball, and then shake off the soot before returning to normal. It's actually a fairly unique and novel concept that incentivizes players to intentionally get attacked by enemies in order to discover new abilities and uncover hidden secrets. Honestly, I feel like this could have been a staple of the Wario Land series, but alas, all good things must come to an end, because when Wario Land 4 released on the Game Boy Advance, the developers opted to completely do away with the concept of Wario's immortality and instead gave him a stock standard health bar in return. But of course, that didn't stop Wario Land 4 from garnering critical acclaim for its wacky slapstick animation and immense replay value. Tinkering around with Wario's immortality and leveraging it as a gameplay mechanic was tossed out and essentially abandoned. And it's a damn shame too, because it's such a novel gameplay mechanic. You'd think it would be used in more titles, but alas, this wasn't the case. This hasn't stopped Wario from becoming a pseudo-meme icon and a prominent character in the Mario franchise. And hell, there's always a chance that Nintendo could be cooking something up behind the scenes as a Switch 2 exclusive. But then again, I could just be optimistic, and the chances of Wario receiving another mainline entry could be as likely as Waluigi being playable in Smash Bros. Sorry, I had to go there. So, if you were even remotely involved in video games in the 2010s, you're more than likely aware of the absurdly high amounts of infamy that one particular company was garnering around that time: Electronic Arts. Believe it or not, there was a time when EA was somewhat of a revered company in the eyes of gamers. I mean, they weren't perfect, but before they got egregiously money-hungry, they were cranking out some of the most acclaimed and influential titles on the market, as well as a few underrated gems to spice things up. But then, along came the 2010s, and almost single-handedly, Electronic Arts would make a litany of decisions that would sour their reputation among gamers worldwide. They became notorious for buying studios and their properties, utilizing them to strong degrees of success, and then dropping them like a bad habit once the sales figures weren't up to par. They owned one of the largest sports franchises, Madden, and became extremely complacent in regards to the quality of the titles, as they were essentially releasing the same game every year with negligible differences and charging full price. However, the most egregious sin that the company committed was its massive emphasis on microtransactions. It didn't matter what genre of game you released, you could bet bet your bottom dollar that EA was ready to pump it full of alluring microtransactions. While this eventually did backfire after 2017's Star Wars Battlefront 2 pushed the envelope a little too aggressively, it was arguably 2015's Star Wars Battlefront that could be viewed as a defining moment in which gamers began to aggressively loathe EA's business decisions. See, the Battlefront games fixated on the large-scale battles that took place in the Star Wars universe. And although the games were critically and financially successful, a scrapped third entry left fans wanting more. And when EA managed to score a deal with Disney that gave them exclusive access to develop Star Wars games, the stars began to align for the company. And what ensued was the release of Star Wars Battlefront 2015. While there were some admirable qualities that impressed die-hard Star Wars fans, it was a blatantly bare-bones experience that sequestered most of the content behind a DLC season pass that provided significantly more content than the base game did. When the game first released, it had a very limited suite of modes and characters to choose from, but a fan-favorite aspect was the ability to choose a fan-favorite Star Wars character after accruing enough points and going on a fucking massacre as you annihilate enemy hordes with relatively little hassle. However, in the early days of the game's release, there was one particular character that absolutely dominated most, if not all modes that he was available in. We're talking about Boba Fett.
Don't get in my way.
Boba Fett put the Hunter in Bounty Hunter for a multitude of reasons. First and foremost, his blaster absolutely shredded through enemy defenses. Then there's his jetpack, which in the early days had ludicrously high amounts of mobility, so much so that he could easily soar up to out-of-reach vantage points and massacre the opposing team from a distance. But then, there was his rocket barrage. Boba's rocket barrage almost single-handedly catapulted him to the top of the ranks, as it was originally capable of blasting homing missiles that fully locked onto a target and completely decimated the opponent's meter within mere seconds. In Heroes vs. Villains mode, this was arguably even worse, because if you were able to successfully dispatch Boba Fett, guess what? Since there's no point requirement for selecting a hero, Boba Fett would always come back with a full suite of rockets in his arsenal, ready to let loose on your location. It was a nightmare, and Boba Fett's notoriety as an overpowered nuisance quickly skyrocketed him to becoming the most played character in the game by a metric mile. Oh, don't believe me? Well, EA confirmed this after they released a graph that showcased the stats that the community achieved within mere weeks of the game's launch. Yeah, it was that bad. So eventually, the developers opted to nerf Boba Fett in a January of 2016 update, and needless to say, Boba Fett wasn't just slightly weakened for balancing purposes, he was given the old Kentucky snip job without even an ounce of lidocaine and branded as the town jester. His blaster damage was significantly reduced, his jetpack was stripped of its original qualities, and made it significantly more difficult to reach vantage points, but neither one of these were even close to his worst nerf. Far from it. They absolutely fucking butchered Boba Fett's rockets. See, as I mentioned earlier, his rockets were imbued with a lock-on feature, and were packed to the brim with copious amounts of damage, making him one of the easiest characters to master. In the update, Boba Fett's lock-on feature wasn't just tweaked or refined, but outright removed from his kit, meaning that you actually had to aim the rockets in order to inflict any amount of damage. Sounds fine enough, that is until you realize that they also severely weakened the damage of the rockets themselves, meaning that Boba Fett mains were now in for a rude awakening. For the remainder of Star Wars Battlefront's lifespan, Boba Fett would remain a laughingstock in the game's meta, and it wasn't until Star Wars Battlefront 2 that he would eventually be redeemed and tweaked a bit to retain his original pre-patch gameplay style with a much more balanced suite of abilities.
Hello?